Ready.
Let's get this show on the road then. All right, everybody, good afternoon. I'm Michael Scharf. I'm the co-dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the summer 2020 Case Western Reserve University School of Law's Institute for Global Security Law and Policy Distinguished Lecture. You know, our international law program is ranked in the top 10 in the country by Pre-Law magazine, and our alums include some incredible people. For example, Admiral Janet Donovan, recently retired, was the first female head of the JAG Corps for the Navy Reserve. Mohammed Chambas, he was the UN chief mediator for Darfur, and now he's head of the Africa Bureau at the UN. Austin Fragaman, he not only started our International Law Journal 52 years ago, but he also began and is now the head of the world's largest immigration law firm. And Francis Champagne, who is now the Foreign Minister of Canada. But today, we are very privileged to host a live presentation by one of our very most impactful alums, John Sopko, class of 1977. In John's illustrious career, he has been a federal prosecutor, counsel to several congressional committees, a partner at a large DC law firm, and since 2012, he has served as Inspector General for Afghanistan reconstruction. After the 9/11 attacks, the United States launched a military operation to topple the Taliban government and drive al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. After initial success, the US initiated an enormous reconstruction and relief program, one of the largest, perhaps the largest, since the post-World War II Marshall Plan. With so much money pouring into Afghanistan, in 2008, the US Congress created a watchdog agency, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, to investigate and report on waste, fraud, and abuse. President Obama appointed John Sopko as the Chief Inspector General. In today's remarks, John will speak about his federal agency's unique mission, the challenges it faces in conducting oversight in Afghanistan, and the challenges to sustainable peace in Afghanistan in the wake of the US Taliban agreement signed in February. After about 30 minutes, about 5 minutes after the hour, we'll open the program up for questions from our online audience. If you want to ask questions during, just type them into the chat function, and our producer will collect those questions and start asking them at 5 minutes after. It is now my pleasure to turn the program over to Inspector General John Sopko. John?
Thank you. And thank you very much, Michael, for those kind comments and also for the invitation to be here today. It is truly an honor to come back and to address my alma mater and discuss the work of my little agency with that tobacco-sounding acronym, SIGAR, but we're with the S, not the C. I'm only sad that I can't speak to you today in person, that I can't be there in Cleveland, since I always enjoy coming back to Cleveland and marveling at all the changes and all the improvements, and also visiting some of my family, which still reside in Cleveland. It's changed a lot in the 43 years since I graduated from Case Western. Those were challenging times for any of you who were in Cleveland back at that time. The river had just stopped burning a couple of years before. Our city was teetering on default, and eventually it did with the under Mayor Kucinich. But more importantly for me in my later profession, Cleveland was known as the bomb capital of the nation, because for the decade during which I was in law school there and before, there was a war going on between two rival factions to take over the mafia family in Cleveland. But what I really remember about my experience back in Cleveland, and what I really do think I miss, and I think I could still imbibe or enjoy, is that chance to go out to Schleiman's, or Sly's as we used to call it, and get a corned beef sandwich there, which was about the size of a rapid transit car, if I recall. And the other thing was to go down to Mayfield Road and go to Guarino's and get that pasta by the gallon. Just between you, me, and my cardiologist, that's probably what I missed the most. So maybe the next
those
time.
Are still here, yeah. And you're welcome to come back and visit as well, coronavirus lives.
Next time after coronavirus, let's enjoy. But putting those culinary memories aside, I promised the dean today to share some of my thoughts about my 8 years at SIGAR and our nation's longest war, and especially my observations from my last trip to Afghanistan. I go there 4 times a year, and I was there just before the country got shut down because of the coronavirus. But before I do that, let me just tell you a little bit about who we are, what we do, and why we do what we do at SIGAR. As the dean alluded to, Congress established SIGAR in 2008, 7 years after the attacks of September 11th, and after our invasion of Afghanistan, but not after we've already spent billions of dollars on reconstruction. Why did Congress do that? Because there's so many other IGs out there. Well, the reason was Congress felt that they needed an independent oversight capability that's focused solely on Afghanistan and solely on reconstruction, in light of all the reports in the press of money being wasted. At 137 billion, that's with a B, and counting, Afghanistan has become the most expensive reconstruction project in the history of the United States. And again, to put it in some context, that's more money, I think $10 billion now, than we spent on the entire reconstruction of Western Europe under the Marshall Plan. So it gives you an idea about how large that is. And it's been the largest reconstruction and development we have ever done before, and are still doing. Now, as an Office of Inspector General, as many in the audience will know, we have the general law enforcement authorities as well as auditing authorities, just like my 73 other fellow inspectors general who you've read about recently in the press. But SIGAR is a little different, and I think that difference is what makes us, I think, special, and it also makes it of interest and useful when we talk about a place like Afghanistan. Unlike every other of the 70-some inspectors general, we are not housed in a specific federal agency. And for those of you who study government process and government procedures, that makes a difference. Because although we file our reports with Congress and we file them with the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State, because we need someplace to file them, we basically report to the President and Congress. As a result, excuse me, SIGAR is not limited at just looking at the funds of the agency we're housed in. We have the ability to look at the whole of government. We actually have the ability, unlike any other IG, to look at any US government agency that spends money in Afghanistan on reconstruction. So whether it's aid, state, DOD, justice, transportation, or whatever. So that makes us kind of unique. It makes us able to look at the whole of government approach to a problem, something that most IGs are not able to do. The other thing that makes us different is, with the exception of 2 other IGs, we are a temporary agency. We go out of existence. And I actually am a firm believer in temporary agencies. In our case, we go out of existence and are shut down 180 days after the amount of reconstruction money not yet spent falls below $250 million. So at this stage, there's about $9 billion already authorized, appropriated, and not yet spent. And we expect to see more money appropriated in this budget cycle. Now, I must add, one of the other things that really makes us unique is our assignment. And we have the toughest, I think, the toughest oversight mission in the United States government at this time. For even after 18 years of US and coalition military support and economic largesse to the Afghan government and people, Afghanistan remains one of the poorest, least educated, and most corrupt countries in the world. And I must add, one of the most dangerous and violent. And to maintain our aggressive oversight efforts in face of these dangers, SIGAR has augmented the 25 staff members we usually have in Kabul and in Afghanistan with satellite imagery. We've retained the services of Afghan non-governmental organizations who we verify their work. And we've also hired Afghans who are, it's more easily and safer for them to travel around than US civilian employees who usually carry with them a target on their back and a large group of security guards. But even with those additional resources, there are some places in Afghanistan that SIGAR can't go, that most US Americans can't go, even in our military, and where the Afghan government can't go. So despite those challenges, SIGAR's accomplishments, I must say, and of course I'm a little biased, I think has been significant. We have issued over 600 audits and other reports and made over 1,000 recommendations to the US government agencies. And we've identified over $1.4 billion from our audits of money that we can save for the taxpayer. Our criminal investigators, in addition, have conducted over 1,100 investigations, made 129 arrests, secured 147 guilty pleas or conviction, and they have recovered for the government an additional $1.6 billion in fines, restitutions, forfeiture, civil settlements, and other savings for the taxpayer. So in total, our work and the work of our nearly 200 auditors, analysts, and engineers and investigators has saved the American taxpayer approximately $3 billion. Okay, let's set aside who SIGAR is. On February 29th of this year, while I happened to be in Afghanistan, the United States signed a peace agreement. Now that was monumental. That's the first time we've had an agreement with the Taliban. Among other provisions, the United States has pledged to reduce our military presence from approximately 13,000 soldiers to 8,600 within 135 days of the signing. Provided the Taliban meet their counterterrorism commitments, and that's a big proviso, all remaining troops, and in addition, all U.S. non-diplomatic personnel, including contractors, are to leave the country within 14 months, or approximately May of 2021. Now, the military drawdown has already begun, and from all accounts, it is on track to meet that first benchmark. It appears, therefore, on the surface, that our nation's longest war, 18 years and counting, may be nearing a conclusion. But as General Kenneth McKenzie, head of U.S. Central Command, said just 2 weeks ago, the Taliban have not yet met conditions to complete troop withdrawal by next May. Now, as I mentioned, I was in Kabul during the signing of the peace agreement, and while there was cautious optimism from my meetings with U.S. officials, U.S. military officials, Afghans, the International Diplomatic Corps. There was also, however, recognition that there is a long way to go, and the process, as has been noted by both Secretary of State Pompeo and Secretary of Defense Esper, can be derailed at any moment. Moreover, there was a consensus from those talks that the talks going on, well, they haven't gone on, the talks promised between the Afghan government and the Taliban on Afghanistan's future will be even more complicated than the recently completed U.S. Taliban negotiations. And again, I must emphasize, those talks haven't even started yet. Now, that's especially going to be difficult because of revelations by the UN that the Taliban have not broken ties with Al-Qaeda, and also because of recent revelations that the violence conducted by the Taliban has been and is exceeding what the violence level was before the peace agreement. So the bottom line is that even with the signatures on the agreement, many risks to sustainable peace remain. Now, as those of you who have been following Afghanistan over the years probably note that a lot of the press coverage has focused, and I think rightly so, on the loss of blood and treasure on all sides. And we can't forget that. Over 2,300 American soldiers have lost their lives, and over 20,000 more have been seriously wounded in Afghanistan. And we can't forget their sacrifice. Nor can we ignore the tens and tens of thousands of Afghan troops and settlements and civilians, slaughtered over the last 18 years. Many, unfortunately, as collateral damage from US and coalition actions. But I caution you, the viability of the Afghan state does not depend on bullets and bombs alone. There's a tendency to focus just on the troop level and focus just on the military. To put it simply, based upon our work, and you talk to any expert who's looked at Afghanistan, without financial support from the international donor community, the Afghan government cannot survive. International donors, as we reported in our last quarterly report, provide approximately 75%, that's 75% of Afghanistan's total public expenditures. And the World Bank has recently estimated that between 4.6 and $8.2 billion of donor funding will be required per year through at least 2024, and that's assuming it's a post-peace settlement environment. That means no violence or little violence. So why is the Afghan government so dependent on donor support, you may ask? Well, it's because donor spending, besides donor spending, I should say, there is not much that actually drives the licit Afghan economy. Going back in time, Afghanistan's economic growth rate averaged close to double digits for the first decade of Reconstruction. With development funds pouring into the country, a large international military presence that was spending, all of that amounted to a sizable but not permanent fiscal stimulus. Since the drawdown of the US and coalition troops in 2014 and security transition, growth has unfortunately in Afghanistan been stuck in the low single digits. The World Bank recently reported that Afghanistan's GDP growth in 2019 was only 2.9%. That might not be a bad number in a developed economy, but it is the second lowest in South Asia, which, if you exclude Afghanistan, averages over 5% growth in GDP every year. And right now, it appears that the COVID-19 pandemic is dashing hopes for higher growth over the next several years there. A panel of experts convened by the Wilson Center just last month predicted that the Afghan economy would contract sharply in 2020, perhaps by as much as 10%. And according to the IMF, quote, the pandemic is inflicting severe economic and social damage with its depth and duration subject to great uncertainty, unquote. As an example, 55% of the Afghans live below their poverty limit. And that has grown from 2012 when it was only 38%. And just so you know what poverty level is in Afghanistan, that is $1 a day, or approximately $360 per year. Sadly, all experts agree that that figure seems likely to grow as Afghanistan and the broader region continue to feel the effects of slower economic activity, the results of the lockdown, and other measures implemented in an effort to mitigate the virus's spread. Now, my little agency has repeatedly been reporting that despite receiving nearly $35 billion in U.S. assistance for governance and economic development, Afghanistan's economy is floundering. That was even before the pandemic. USAID and DoD, I'm happy to report, have recently focused on growing Afghanistan's private sector economy. But there are cautionary tales to that. And these cautionary tales demonstrate how apparent success can quickly turn into abject, even dangerous failure. Let me give you an example. I think many of you have probably heard over the years the talk about Afghanistan's minerals and natural resources as being the goose that laid the golden egg. This goes back to 2010 when the Department of Defense, citing the U.S. Geological Survey data, said that Afghanistan held over $900 billion worth of mineral resources. Obviously, everybody said in the donor community that if the government of Afghanistan could turn those resources into jobs and export revenue, the economic outlook of Afghanistan would change dramatically to the better. In 2012, as a result of this, a recently formed Guernsey-based company called Centaur convinced the Afghan government that it could help spearhead an effort to improve Afghanistan's economy through the extraction of its mineral resources. And the Centaur case is a good case example. That company was set up by an investment banker and former British SAS officer from JP Morgan, who was initially invited to Afghanistan by that DoD-sponsored business task force, which had done that analysis on the revenue from the extractives industry. Over $30 million was invested into Centaur with the hopes of capitalizing on the extraction of gold and copper in Afghanistan. At the time of the agreement and the signing of the contract between Centaur and the Afghan government, Centaur, like many others before, claimed that, quote, the development of Afghanistan's mineral deposits would be truly transformative for the country. To great applause and celebration, that statement came out. Everybody was looking for the best. Unfortunately, like many times in Afghanistan, the celebrations don't last too long. As the government of Afghanistan finally, or eventually, shortly thereafter, I should say, canceled the contract with less than a year later, claiming that Centaur had not met its contractual obligations. Now, the story doesn't end there. According to a recent Financial Times report, as of last month, Centaur was almost out of money and shareholders were meeting to determine the company's future. The Financial Times also reported that the company's heavy drilling and extraction equipment was now in the hands of the Taliban forces, who were mining gold to financially support their insurgency. Now, we haven't confirmed that last part, but we have confirmed that Centaur, in a letter to its shareholders, noted that, quote, the Taliban have established their own Ministry of Mining in Qatar, with their own people on the ground in Afghanistan, collecting revenues and operating mines nationally, which have led to, quote unquote, a profitable mining industry. Centaur's letter apparently noted that its mine in Badakhshan province had turned out to be a great success. Unfortunately, it's been a great success just to the Taliban, not to Centaur, not to its investors, not to the Afghan government, or to their people. This is just one example of many efforts to jumpstart the Afghan economy that not only failed, but also in many cases backfired. And many of those efforts were underwritten by you, the US taxpayer, through USAID or Department of Defense. Nevertheless, I want to make it clear, we believe the effort to strengthen Afghanistan's economy is logical and necessary. But it has to be done while taking into account that 600-pound gorilla in the room, because you can't succeed if you ignore him. And who is that 600-pound gorilla, you may ask? It is, of course, corruption. Transparency International's most recent corruption perception index ranks Afghanistan as tied to 173rd out of 180 countries, ranking it less corrupt than only Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, and Somalia. Now, SIGAR investigations have identified corruption at virtually every level of the Afghan state, from salaries paid by international donors for Afghan soldiers and police who do not really exist, we call them ghosts, to theft of US military provided fuel on a massive scale, to price fixing of billion-dollar contracts, to hundreds of Afghan contractors and subcontractors who ripped off the US taxpayer based upon sole source contracts steered by corrupt and incompetent officials. Independent surveys have highlighted over the years that most Afghans report having to deal with corruption on almost a daily basis, often in the form of a bribe to a government official to get something the government should otherwise be providing for free, such as access to healthcare, justice, or education. But I want to stop for a second and be perfectly clear here. Corruption in Afghanistan is not like corruption in the United States. Corruption in Afghanistan is not just a criminal justice issue. Systemic corruption in Afghanistan goes way beyond that. As we noted in our 2016 Lessons Learned report, corruption is a strategic threat to our entire mission in Afghanistan. It is the most insidious threat to the Afghan government also faces, because it saps the support of citizens who are trying to go about their daily lives, feed their families, and also live free of fear and intimidation. It is also used by insurgent groups to undermine government support and garner recruits for their cause. Additionally, and this is a key to today's discussion, it acts as an extreme disincentive for the private sector investment that Afghanistan so desperately needs in a post-peace environment, when donors are likely to reduce or eliminate their financial support to the government. As Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who I assume many of you know, and Dean, you may know from your days at the State Department, he reestablished our embassy in Kabul after 9/11, and also led our embassy there from 2011 and 12. What he told our staff was, quote, "The ultimate point of failure to our efforts was not the insurgency. It was the weight of endemic corruption," unquote. Now, I can't compare my own life, and I don't think anyone in the United States can, to the experience and our experience to someone who has grown up in Afghanistan and faced the problems there, particularly corruption. But I do know from my firsthand experience that fighting corruption takes blood, sweat, tears, and years. As many of you have probably heard or read in my bio, as a young attorney, who I recently graduate from case, I investigated and prosecuted the deeply entrenched tentacles of organized crime in Ohio. And I learned then, as I've learned, and everyone else who has fought organized crime in the United States has learned, is that the sine qua non of organized crime is corruption. And that is key, and that's the key in Afghanistan also. So if in the heartland of Ohio, we can suffer from the corruption during my professional lifetime, then we know what a challenge it is to combat it in a country like Afghanistan, which doesn't have the history of rule of law and has also struggled through decades of war and economic instability. I recall a newly appointed, young, honest, Western-educated Afghan minister once asking me, "John, how do I fight corruption when everyone in my ministry is corrupt?" And it was interesting because I was looking around the room and there were all people working with him, and I was thinking, including everybody in this room? That was a tough question. And I don't know if I gave him the right answer. Unfortunately, after doing this for 8 years, I'm not certain anyone in my government either has given the right answer. Yet fighting corruption is the key to creating the economic environment necessary to attract private and particularly international investment needed to grow Afghanistan's economy. Businesses will not invest if there is no transparency. Businesses will not invest if they are not assured that any grievance they have will be fairly addressed and adjudicated by legal and judicial systems that respect and enforce the rule of law. And laws are essential. We all know that. We're all lawyers. But laws learned are mere words on a paper if they are not backed by a political will, and in this case, a political will of the Afghan government's part to provide even-handed and aggressive enforcement. Now, because of SIGAR's long experience investigating corruption in Afghanistan, the two congressional appropriations committees have given us an unprecedented task, I think, for any IG. I don't know of any other IG who's been asked to assess a foreign government, and we have been. We were asked to assess the Afghan government's anti-corruption strategy and its implementation. Our first assessment was publicly issued in 2018, and the appropriators have requested annual updates, and we're right in the midst of doing one right now. But what we found in those first two assessments is that the Afghan government, in an attempt to please the international donors, has been very good at quote unquote checking the box and putting anti-corruption policies on paper, creating numerous institutions without usually resourcing any of them or listening to any of them. SIGAR's assessment findings were reinforced in a report just issued last week by the United Nations. The UN confirmed what SIGAR found, that the Afghan government has yet to prove that anti-corruption laws are equally enforced across all offenders, regardless of wealth and power or political standing. They also found that powerful, politically connected Afghans often act with impunity, making it difficult for the Afghan government to demonstrate a commitment, a true commitment to fighting corruption. Now, while political will is always difficult to measure, some practical examples that we should be seeing if the Afghan government was serious about corruption would include the extradition of suspects from overseas, the arrest, trial, and imprisonment of powerful individuals engaged in corruption, significant output from anti-corruption courts, the recovery of stolen assets, proper resourcing of anti-corruption organizations, and transparency in law as well as in contracting. Unfortunately, we have found little, if any, evidence of efforts by the Afghan government to take those steps, something it confirmed in a series of frank discussions I had with our embassy and our military officials, as well as other donor country ambassadors on my last trip to Kabul. For example, as of last January, there were 6,500 outstanding arrest warrants for corruption-related offenses, and the Afghan government could not provide us with a timeline for completing those arrests. The Afghan government at that time had recovered less than 1% of the financial penalties issued by the country's top anti-corruption body, the Afghan Anti-Corruption Justice Center. And there was a 22% decline in the number of individuals prosecuted by the Justice Center between 2018 and 2019, way before the COVID virus hit. And this disappointment with the Afghan government continues to this day, in light of recent information that we have picked up that one of the masterminds between the failure of the largest bank in Afghanistan is now under serious consideration to oversee a major Afghan government agency, which has a lot of contracting authority. So while the Afghan government may be able to get away with paying lip service to the UN, US, and the rest of the donor community about its anti-corruption commitment, the private sector, which cares far more about its own bottom line than it cares about Afghanistan's future, will not overlook Afghanistan's failure to deal with corruption. Afghanistan's leaders must come to realize that in the end, private sector investment will matter far more to their country's future than international donors. Because after 18 years of war, foreign governments, including the United States, are growing weary of paying for Afghanistan's bills. As many foreign ambassadors to Afghanistan told me on the last trip, the patience of their parliaments back home and the voters that elect them is not endless, even if it appears the war is. So, in conclusion, let me just say this after 8 years doing this. There's one certainty about Afghanistan, and that is constant uncertainty. Unfortunately for Afghanistan, uncertainty deters private sector investment more than anything else, and corruption greatly adds to that uncertainty. So whatever the outcome of the intra-Afghan negotiations, and we hope they start and we hope they succeed, whoever assumes the mantle of leadership in Kabul after them will inherit a weak economy. He will, or they will, inherit a waning donor interest. They will inherit the inability to attract private sector investment unless and until corruption is taken seriously and properly addressed. You know, it's always dangerous to predict the future in Afghanistan. I've learned that over the 8 years. But let me conclude with this little prognostication. If the rampant corruption that has contaminated Afghanistan is not dealt with, then private sector growth will not materialize, and the donor community will eventually tire of coming to Afghanistan's rescue. When that occurs, the country's economy and government could well collapse with a return to civil war, the rise of a new or re-energized fundamentalist movement, or the full transformation of Afghanistan into a narco-terrorist state. So let me end with that little bit of prediction from the crystal ball, and I hope that you find this useful, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions.
So John, you have lived up to your reputation as a straight shooter who does not pull his punches. Let me kick things off. I do see that we have questions coming in the chat, and I want to encourage everybody to start sending in their questions as fast as they can. But let me start with one of my own. Back in January of 2020, you had a really extraordinary report to Congress where you were critical of the US government for overstating the progress and also classifying bad news related to Afghanistan. And I'm wondering what has resulted from that report.
I should be honest, not much. No, I'm trying to remember which report. Are you talking about the Afghanistan papers, Dean? Am I, or is the person who asked that question talking about that?
Is that what they're calling it, like the Pentagon Papers?
Yeah, that was the Washington Post did a 6-part series on that, and it was based upon FOIA. They FOIA'd all of our unedited interview notes from our lessons learned program, and we've done about 6 or 7 lessons learned. So I testified like 3 times after those reports came out. And, you know, Congress is upset that they're not hearing all the facts. So that's pretty clear. And we've got strong support from Congress about them wanting to know the facts. But you know, I can't say with certainty that there has been a change. I mean, the problem is we still are not getting information. And, you know, look at, I like to use the line, I'm an old country lawyer from Ohio. I grew up in the Buckeye State. And, you know, I like to, and I've used this as my standard, I like to look at the government the same way I look at my personal business dealings, my personal dealings, you know. If I pay a contractor to build me a house, I expect him to come back and tell me how he's doing. And that's how I judge whether he's a good contractor or not, or I'm going to get a good house. So it's simple common sense. I remember when I was doing trial work and one of the professors said, you know, remember to tell your jurors that they don't leave their prior experience and reason and common sense at the jury room when they go in to make a verdict. You know, that comes along with them, your experience. And so my experience is that we're paying $137 billion, the U.S. taxpayer, you, me, everybody on this call, hopefully they're paying taxes. So how good a job are we doing? Well, you can't tell if they keep classifying all the information about how good the Afghan government is, the Afghan military, I mean, we can't even tell the American taxpayer what percentage of the country the Afghan government controls. I mean, isn't that ridiculous? You as a taxpayer should know how well your money is being spent. And I can't report that. We used to report it. We used to report all that data. We used to report all the analysis. But over the last few years, it's all now classified. So it hasn't changed much. We still have a lot of congressmen who are upset, who are supporting us in our task. But I do feel like Sisyphus sometimes. You know, every quarter we issue a report saying this has been classified now. This has been withheld. They're not collecting this. And what do you want me to do as an IG? So I don't know if that answers the question from the questioner.
It doesn't. It leads to this next question. This is from Ken Myers, who has identified himself as an old friend of yours.
Oh my God, I know Ken. Oh my God.
he says, John, how have you been able to avoid the political winds that blow both because of international atmospherics, but also the volatile domestic situation?
Because I went to Case Western Reserve Law School and I learned how to dodge and weave. You know, I don't know. I think the answer to that is I'm a straight shooter. And all my years on the Hill, I've been known to be a straight shooter, and I call it like it is. And I worked for Sam Nunn, who was a Democrat, and we did more investigations on Democrats than we did Republicans. And I've always been known to be a nonpartisan investigator on the Hill. And that's the way we are now. We are like, we're not liked. Let's just be clear. If you're an IG and you want a friend, do what Truman suggests, go off and buy a dog. Because every time we issue an audit or a report, as I tell my staff, you're goring somebody's ox. Somebody's not happy. Whether it's a contractor, whether it's a corrupt Afghan official, whether it's a military general you name who screwed up or whatever. But that's our job. And my view is, you know, I'm like the umpire. I call balls and strikes. Doesn't mean I don't support the game, but I call the balls and strikes as I see them. And as far as I know, we have been accurate on everything. And where we've made a mistake, we are honest to it and say, we changed that. We made a mistake. But we've had very few mistakes. So I don't know, maybe I'm lucky. Maybe, you know, who wants to be a special IG in Afghanistan? I don't know. But I think just calling the balls and strikes, not getting partisan on this, none of this is partisan. This is about Americans, American taxpayers, Americans who died. And it's nonpartisan. I don't play partisan games. And I think everybody knows that. I was on the Hill for 20 some years, and I think they know that.
John, the next question is, what issues would you like to look at that you have not yet focused on in Afghanistan?
You know, a couple, one, and we are looking at it now. We're doing a lessons learned report on gender issue and gender equality. And I think that's going to raise some interesting issues. And that's part of our lessons learned program. Let me just say this to the audience, and particularly the person. I have never, no one, Democrat, Republican, Obama, Trump, no one has ever tried to interfere with us doing an investigation or audit. So first of all, we audit, and no one's ever tried to cancel or quash an audit or do anything. So I've been lucky about that. But there are issues beyond audits and beyond investigations and beyond inspections that we're able to capture in this lessons learned program. And if you want to find out more about the lessons learned program, you can go on our website and we describe it. We're the only IG who does that. And that has allowed us to look at some of these issues that are really cross-cutting our whole of government. And those issues, and one I said is gender we're looking at. We're going to be doing a report on elections and looking at that. We're going to be looking at monitoring and evaluation. So I really can't think of any one issue that we haven't looked at or aren't we don't have it scheduled to look at. So I really can't say there's been one. We don't ask the ultimate questions, and that's because we're IGs. Should we be in Afghanistan or not Afghanistan? That's not an IG's question to answer. We do process. That's a policy question. Don't let the audience think that we're going to do a report on whether we should have gone in Afghanistan or not. That's not my job. My job is to look at process. But I think we are covering the map on process.
So the next question is interesting. It asks about how much of the corrupt activity in Afghanistan is attributable to foreign states. And it asks whether China in particular has played any role in Afghanistan.
Foreign states have contributed to corruption. And unfortunately, the United States and the donors are the main culprits in this. And not because we went out of our way to bribe people. It's because we just poured so much money. I say we poured too much money too fast in too small a country with too little oversight and no accountability for years before they even created SIGAR. And that contributed to the corruption. I remember talking to President Ghani, and he mentioned, and I see him almost every time I go to Afghanistan, but I remember him once saying, people accuse the Afghans of being corrupt by nature. And he said, and he used to teach in New York. And I think he said, he remembers, he asked me, he said, did you remember there was once a Brinks armored truck that I think on the West Side Highway flipped over, the doors opened up and dollar bills scattered all over the place. And they started falling. The wind picked them up and they were falling from heaven. And he said, Americans, New Yorkers, stopped their cars to grab the dollar bills falling from the sky. He says, does that mean the New Yorkers are inherently corrupt? And he says, no. I mean, if money starts falling from the sky, you grab it because you don't know when it's going to stop. And he said, that's what happened with you guys. You guys put in too much money with too little controls for such a long time. And so I think that's more of a problem. As for China itself, there have been allegations. We have not looked into it because it's, it was before we got there that there's some Chinese contractors paid some major bribes to get some access to some copper mining areas. But I don't have the data on that. But I am certain everybody has taken a chance to bribe Afghan officials, and it succeeded.
The next question asks if your portfolio includes war crimes committed by all sides.
No, it doesn't. We came close to that. Again, we just do reconstruction. But we were asked by Congress about, I think it was like 140 some members of the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, to look at the Leahy Act and how the Leahy Act was being applied in Afghanistan. And this was based upon some allegations made by U.S. troops who were advising Afghan police. And they saw gross violations of human rights. And so these members of Congress asked us to look at that. And that was tied directly to Reconstruction, because we've given billions of dollars to the Afghan military and police. So this was right up our alley. But normally, human rights violations, we would not get involved in.
The next question asks if the Taliban is perceived as less corrupt than the Afghan government.
In some parts of the country, they are, and they have used the corruption, whether it's accurate or not, they've used the corruption of the Afghan government and Afghan officials to recruit. And that's why I said this is a national security. This is a security issue, goes beyond just corruption. Whether they are or not, I don't know. We don't have access. We don't audit the Taliban, thank God. Although it isn't interesting what's going to happen if the government is a joint government. I don't know who's going to audit U.S. or money that goes to a government that's partially controlled by the Taliban. There have been scattered reports by academics. A number of academics have looked at that. We know that the Taliban, and this has been written by many experts on the Taliban, that they actually have sort of an internal audit function that goes out and makes certain that their captains and commanders don't steal the money. But we don't really know. It's all anecdotal to us, so I can't tell you. But they do use it as a recruiting tool. And that is the problem, one of the problems, that the Taliban will recruit people because they'll point at the corruption and they'll say, look, at the Americans are part of this because they're giving all the money to these corrupt officials.
So you mentioned before, John, that your portfolio doesn't include human rights or war crimes. Does it include looking at narcotics trafficking?
Yes, because Reconstruction money went to that, over $8 billion, and we have reported that it's been a total failure. We wasted $8 billion.
Ooh. All right, so that leads to this question.
That on a positive note, we bought a lot of airplanes.
Yeah, the next question is corruption in Afghanistan inevitable? If so, how much corruption should the U.S. tolerate when supplying funds?
You know, that's a really, really good question, and I've been asked that a lot of times. And what I'll answer it in two parts. First of all, if a U.S. official or U.S. contractor or U.S. citizen is involved in corruption, then we will find him if we can, indict him, and send him to jail. Because we have zero tolerance for U.S. government officials, whether they're contracting officers, generals, commanders, you name it, aid officials, they go to jail. So zero tolerance. The other question you're asking is a more difficult question, and we cover this in our first lessons learned report, which was on corruption. Everybody said we should do that first because it's so important. And the answer is, look to the Afghans. What degree of corruption do they tolerate? And at what point they don't tolerate, that's what we should follow. Let the Afghans tell us what they can tolerate. So paying a small bribe is one thing, but if it's the entire system is corrupt, that's another thing. And let me just give you an anecdote if I can. And I think this kind of brought home to me how bad the corruption issue was. And I told you, I go there like every 4 times a year. I don't know, 28 sometimes. I got a lot of frequent flyer miles going to Afghanistan, but that's a hard way to earn frequent flyer miles, that's for sure. But I've developed a lot of friends, I would say friends, colleagues in the Afghan government and in their civil society. And I know quite a few, and all of them are brave. And a lot of them are really, really risking their lives every day to do their job, and particularly if they're fighting corruption. And I remember on one trip, I remember coming home from the trip, and my office, as well as my wife, I think, boy, you're more depressed than usual coming back. And what happened was this, just happenstance. I met these people for dinner, 3 young, honest, Western educated Afghans, 2 in the government, 1 outside the government. And we started talking about their families. And all 3 of them said that they had families living out in the countryside. And all 3 of them, including 2 who worked on corruption inside, anti-corruption activities inside the Afghan government, they all independently, they're at 3 different dinners, said that they would tell their parents not to go to the government to handle their legal matter, but to go to the Taliban. I was shocked and depressed. And the reason was, they said, the Taliban are there. They're not working out of Kabul or Herat and never show up in the village because they're afraid. The Taliban don't take bribes. The Taliban actually base their decisions upon evidence. And they make a decision and then they're gone. Then no bribes. But what shocked me, here were three Western educated, young, the future of Afghanistan. And they themselves recognized that the Taliban was more honest and that their own government wasn't. So that told me that the judicial system in Afghanistan's got serious problems, despite all the money we've poured into it. So I don't know if that helps answer both of the last two questions about whether the Taliban is more honest than not, or how do you rate it. But I think when three Afghans, a number of Afghans tell you that they don't trust their own government's judicial system, then that's telling you we got a problem with corruption.
You know, John, about the same time you got appointed to this position, here in Cuyahoga County, in Cleveland, the voters decided to get rid of the county commission form of government and have a county executive because of corruption. And one of our former commissioners ended up in jail. So corruption is not something that just happens in faraway lands. This next question gets to that. It says, this may be a touchy subject, but what parallels do you see as possible solutions to trying to address some of the grift and self-dealing that we have seen over here in the United States?
Well, you know, it's not my job as the cigar to look at the United States corruption here. But as a former federal prosecutor who looked at corruption, I used to teach a course at American University on the history of corruption or history of organized crime in the United States. I think one of the key elements in what we got, and to some extent Afghanistan has, is a free and open press. And that is really essential to fighting corruption or fighting any problem. If, you know, I go back to, I think it was Jefferson who said, you know, I'd rather have a democracy. I'd rather have a free and open press with no democracy, or a democracy without free and open press, because that's what keeps us on our toes. And that's really critical. If you look at Afghanistan, they actually do have, it's relatively free. If you compare it to the countries around Afghanistan, Afghanistan's press is so much better. There is corruption, and there are political bosses that own newspapers and TV stations and radio stations and all that, but that helps. I think we've been fortunate here in the United States that with our federal system, if the state and local government is corrupt, you could always go to the feds. And if you look at the history of fighting organized crime, even going back to the 1930s, you know, you had the Treasury agents came in and used the IRS laws to go after the Chicago mob. You had the federal government come in under Bobby Kennedy to look at corruption down in Cincinnati, Newport, and Covington when the local officials were all corrupt, and as well as in Youngstown, which was a big problem for corruption, even when I was a prosecutor. So I think we've been fortunate about that you've had another alternative that helps, having a federal versus state. Now it's a two-edged sword, because sometimes it's just as horrendous, and if the feds are just as corrupt as the state and local, then you really have, then you got to rely on the press. So those are some of the things I think it's useful to keep in mind with, you know, when I was with the Organized Crime Strike Force, there were all these allegations about the Cleveland police being corrupt. Well, turned out we had a mole in the FBI, and one of all of our, the informant files, all informant files for the FBI were turned over to the mafia. I actually prosecuted the mafia in Cleveland over that. So you can't always say that the state is more corrupt than the feds. And that was one of the cases. Now, this isn't to denigrate the FBI agents. Actually, my first case agent in Cleveland, Doug Doman, is now working for me as head of my investigations unit. And when I got this job, I called him up. I called up a guy who had worked with the GAO for years and said, I'm putting the band together. You want to come? And Doug gave up a fantastic job as a vice president of a corporation to do that. He's been working tirelessly at lower pay to work on that. So there's some tremendous agents.
All right, here's the final question for you. You have mentioned, John, a couple of times that your agency has produced these lesson learned documents. Can you tell us what you would think are the two most important lessons learned from the 18 years of reconstruction in Afghanistan?
I think let's go back to corruption. The first one was we ignored corruption to our peril. We spent too much money too fast, too small a country with too little oversight. And, you know, if you go to bed with dogs, you wake up in the morning with fleas. And that's what we did. We went to bed with a lot of corrupt warlords. And now we created a problem that we are still trying to extricate ourselves from. So that's the first one. The second one was stop before you throw money at a problem and think and bring in some experts who know something about the country. We just poured money in there like a drunken sailor for years. And there are consequences more than just wasting the money. It's creating the corruption. It's totally destroying the economy of Afghanistan through all of that. So I would say that, you know, sometimes smaller is better than bigger. And we have a tendency to doing big things. The third thing, I'm going to answer three. And the third thing is let's learn some lessons. And that's part of our lessons learned program. You know, when we found a lessons learned report done by USAID, and the title of it was, you know, Development in Afghanistan, 1950 to 1979. It's a fascinating report. All you have to do is change the dates, and it was highlighting some of the problems we're finding. But I could not find anybody in USAID, in Kabul, in the State Department, who even knew of the existence of that lessons learned report. So we do a horrible job, particularly state and aid, of doing lessons learned reports, and not only observing, because they're lessons observed until you apply them, then they become lessons learned. So that's the third thing we can do to improve things. You got to stop and do some lessons learned and bring in some experts who know something about those before you do this again. And we will do it again. Despite what everybody's saying, we will do this again.
It's just like what George Santayana always said, if we don't learn the lessons from the past, we're going to be cursed to keep repeating the same mistakes of the past. Well, listen, correct. It's time for us to bring this program to a close. I want to give a huge thank you to my friend, the alum of this law school, and an extraordinary person who's making a huge impact in the world, John Sopko. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your candor and your honesty and your hard-hitting work that you're doing in this area.